In the mists of ancient memory, where legend dances with history and the boundaries between mortal and divine blur like shadows at twilight, there lived a man whose name would outlast empires. The winds that swept across the 7 hills of Rome carried whispers of destiny, and in those whispers, one name would echo through eternity: Gaius Julius Caesar. Let your breathing slow as we journey back through time, to an age when the Mediterranean world trembled before the might of Rome, and one man's ambition would reshape the very foundations of civilization. The story begins not with Caesar himself, but with the ancient bloodlines that flowed through his veins like sacred rivers. The Julian family claimed descent from Venus herself, the goddess of love and beauty, through her son Aeneas, the Trojan hero who fled burning Troy to found the Roman race. Whether this divine heritage was truth or the beautiful invention of noble ambition matters little now, for in the telling and retelling, myth becomes as real as marble. Rest easily as we explore these distant origins, where fact and legend interweave like golden threads in an imperial tapestry. Rome in the 2nd century before Christ was a city drunk on conquest and trembling with the growing pains of empire. The narrow streets echoed with the languages of a dozen conquered peoples, while in the Forum Romanum, senators in pristine togas debated the fate of distant provinces. The republic that had emerged from the ashes of monarchy was now the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, but mastery brought its own burdens. Wealth flowed into the city like a river in flood, transforming ancient customs and creating new tensions between rich and poor, citizen and slave, tradition and ambition. Into this world of marble grandeur and political intrigue, Gaius Julius Caesar was born around the year 100 BCE on a warm summer day when the cicadas sang their ancient songs in the hills above Rome. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a man of respectable rank but modest means, holding the praetorship but never achieving the consulship that marked the pinnacle of Roman political success. His mother, Aurelia, came from the distinguished Cotta family, bringing to the marriage connections that would prove invaluable in the treacherous waters of Roman politics. The Rome of Caesar's childhood was a city of contrasts that would have boggled the ancient mind. Magnificent temples crowned the hills, their marble columns gleaming white in the Mediterranean sun, while in the valleys between, the poor crowded into ramshackle tenements that rose like precarious towers toward the sky. The morning air carried the scent of bread from countless bakeries, mingled with the less pleasant odors of a city that housed perhaps 500,000 souls within its walls. Let these images of ancient Rome wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you deeper into peaceful rest. Young Caesar grew up in the Subura, a bustling neighborhood that was neither the most fashionable nor the most disreputable in Rome. Here, the future dictator played in streets that knew both senators and gladiators, merchants from distant Egypt and freed slaves who had earned their liberty through wit or fortune. The sounds of his childhood were the calls of street vendors hawking everything from fresh fish to imported silk, the rumble of cartwheels on stone pavement, and the ever-present murmur of political discussion that was the lifeblood of the Roman citizen. Education for a boy of Caesar's station began early and followed patterns established by generations of aristocratic tradition. He learned to read and write both Latin and Greek, for Greek was the language of philosophy, poetry, and refined culture. His tutors, likely Greek slaves chosen for their learning, introduced him to the great works of Homer and Euripides, to the historical writings of Herodotus and Thucydides, and to the philosophical teachings of Plato and Aristotle. But Caesar's education was not merely academic. He learned to speak in public, to debate with eloquence, and to move through the complex social rituals that governed aristocratic life. The boy showed early signs of the brilliance that would later dazzle and terrify his contemporaries. His memory was said to be prodigious, capable of retaining vast amounts of information with seemingly effortless ease. He could recite lengthy passages of poetry, recall the names and lineages of countless families, and master the intricate details of law and precedent that formed the backbone of Roman governance. More importantly, he possessed that indefinable quality the Romans called gravitas, a natural dignity and presence that commanded attention and respect. As Caesar entered adolescence, the political landscape of Rome was dominated by two towering figures whose rivalry would define a generation. Gaius Marius, the great general who had saved Rome from Germanic invasion, represented the populares, those politicians who sought power through appeals to the common people. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, equally distinguished in war, led the Optimates, the faction that championed the traditional prerogatives of the Senate and the established order. These two men, once allies and even related by marriage, had become bitter enemies, and their conflict would drench Rome in blood. The young Caesar found himself connected to both factions through the complex web of family relationships that bound the Roman aristocracy together. His uncle by marriage was Marius himself, the old general whose military reforms had transformed the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force loyal to its commanders rather than the state. At the same time, Caesar's family connections reached into the ranks of the Optimates, creating a delicate balance that required careful navigation. When Caesar was perhaps 15 years old, civil war erupted in Rome with a fury that shocked even those accustomed to political violence. Marius, returning from exile with fire in his eyes and vengeance in his heart, unleashed a reign of terror against his enemies. The streets ran red with blood as prescription lists posted in the Forum marked hundreds of senators and wealthy citizens for death. Their only crime was opposition to Marius or possession of wealth that could finance his followers. Bodies floated in the Tiber, and no man could be certain that sunrise would not bring his name to the fatal lists. Into this maelstrom of violence stepped Sulla, returning from his victories in the east with legions hardened by war and loyal to their commander. The civil war that followed was like nothing Rome had ever experienced, pitting citizen against citizen, father against son, in a conflict that would leave scars on the Roman psyche for generations. Breathe deeply and let the weight of these ancient sorrows settle gently upon you, as civilizations have always risen and fallen like the rhythm of sleeping breath. Sulla's victory was as complete as it was terrible. The old general, now dictator with unlimited power, instituted his own prescriptions that made Marius's terror seem mild by comparison. Thousands died, their property confiscated to enrich Sulla's supporters and veterans. The Senate, cowed and purged of opposition, rubber-stamped his constitutional reforms designed to restore traditional authority and prevent future populares from challenging the established order. Young Caesar, now coming of age in this transformed Rome, faced his first major crisis. His connections to Marius through family and his engagement to Cornelia, daughter of Marius's ally Cinna, marked him as potentially dangerous to the new regime. Sulla, whose pale eyes missed nothing, summoned the young man and ordered him to divorce Cornelia as proof of loyalty to the new order. Here was Caesar's first great test, and his response revealed the character that would later shake the world. Caesar refused. Standing before the most powerful man in Rome, a dictator who had ordered the deaths of thousands without blinking, the young aristocrat quietly but firmly declined to abandon his wife. It was an act of remarkable courage or stunning foolhardiness, and it nearly cost him his life. Sulla's advisors urged him to add Caesar's name to the proscription lists, arguing that the young man who could not be bent might one day prove impossible to break. But perhaps the old dictator saw something in Caesar that stayed his hand, or perhaps he was influenced by the pleas of influential relatives. Instead of death, Caesar received exile, a punishment that seemed merciful but carried its own dangers. A young Roman aristocrat alone in the world, stripped of protection and resources, faced perils that might prove as fatal as any executioner's sword. Caesar chose to seek his fortune in the East, where Roman governors and generals offered opportunities for young men of talent and ambition. He sailed from Italy as the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, watching his homeland fade into the distance with emotions we can only imagine. The young man who departed was still largely unformed, his destiny uncertain. The man who would return had been tempered by hardship and adventure into something harder and more brilliant than before. His first destination was Asia, where he served on the staff of Marcus Thermus, the Roman governor struggling to maintain order in the wealthy but turbulent province. Here, Caesar received his first real taste of military life, learning the harsh realities of command and the intricate logistics required to keep Roman legions fed, equipped, and motivated in hostile territory. The eastern provinces were a laboratory for ambitious young Romans, offering lessons in administration, diplomacy, and warfare that could not be learned in the comfortable confines of Rome. It was during this eastern service that Caesar first displayed the personal courage that would become legendary. At the siege of Mytilene, he distinguished himself so notably that he was awarded the civic crown, Rome's highest decoration for bravery. The corona civica, woven from oak leaves, was reserved for those who had saved the life of a fellow citizen in battle, and its possession marked Caesar as a hero in the eyes of his contemporaries. Let this image of young courage settle peacefully in your mind as you drift towards sleep. But Caesar's eastern adventures were far from over. After completing his service with Thermus, he decided to travel to Rhodes to study rhetoric under Apollonius Molon, the greatest teacher of oratory in the Greek world. Public speaking was the key to political success in Rome, and Caesar was determined to master every aspect of the art. The journey to Rhodes, however, would prove more eventful than any classroom instruction. Pirates had long been the scourge of the Mediterranean, their swift vessels striking at merchant ships and coastal settlements with impunity. The Roman navy, designed for massive fleet battles rather than the swift pursuit of raiders, had proven inadequate to the task of suppressing piracy, and the sea lanes remained dangerous for all but the most heavily defended convoys. Caesar, travelling with a small retinue and probably attempting to keep a low profile due to his political circumstances, presented a tempting target. The pirates who captured Caesar somewhere off the coast of Asia Minor expected a routine kidnapping and ransom. Such operations had become almost commonplace, with wealthy Romans paying substantial sums to secure their freedom and return safely home. The pirates demanded 20 talents for Caesar's release, a considerable sum that reflected their assessment of his value based on his clothing, retinue, and bearing. Caesar's response was characteristic of the man he was becoming. Far from cowering before his captors, he laughed at the paltry ransom they demanded and insisted they raise it to 50 talents, declaring that 20 was beneath his dignity. The pirates, probably bewildered by this reaction, found themselves dealing with a captive unlike any they had encountered before. Instead of pleading for mercy or attempting escape, Caesar took charge of the situation through sheer force of personality. During the weeks of his captivity, while messengers carried word of the ransom demand to his friends and allies, Caesar treated the pirates less like captors than like particularly crude servants. He demanded quiet when he wanted to sleep, insisted they listen when he chose to practice his speeches, and wrote poetry that he recited to his bemused audience. When the pirates failed to show proper appreciation for his literary efforts, he cheerfully informed them that he would have them all crucified once he was free. The pirates laughed at what they took for youthful bravado, but they had misjudged their captive completely. When the ransom arrived and Caesar was released, he immediately set about organizing a fleet to pursue his former captors, recruiting ships and men with the same confidence he had displayed in captivity. Within days, he had tracked down the pirate vessel and captured the entire crew that had held him prisoner. True to his word, Caesar had them crucified, but in a gesture that Romans would have recognized as merciful, he ordered their throats cut before the execution began, sparing them the lingering agony that crucifixion typically entailed. It was an early demonstration of the complex character that could combine ruthless determination with unexpected clemency, traits that would define his later career. News of Sulla's death reached Caesar while he was still in the East, and with it came the possibility of returning safely to Rome. The old dictator had surprised everyone by voluntarily laying down his extraordinary powers and retiring to private life, only to die a year later of what some whispered was divine judgment for his crimes. His constitutional reforms remained in place, but the iron grip of personal rule had been relaxed, and exiles began to trickle back to the capital. Caesar's return to Rome marked the beginning of his true political career. He was now in his mid-20s, seasoned by travel and adventure, marked by military distinction, and possessed of the oratorical skills that were essential for success in Roman public life. But Rome itself had changed during his absence, shaped by Sulla's reforms and the lingering trauma of civil war. The city felt different somehow, as if the old certainties had been permanently shaken. He began his career in the traditional manner as a prosecutor in the criminal courts that were the training ground for aspiring politicians. His targets were former governors accused of extortion in their provinces, cases that allowed him to display his rhetorical skills while positioning himself as a champion of justice and good government. His prosecution of Gnaeus Dolabella, a former governor of Macedonia, was particularly notable for its eloquence and legal acumen, even though the case ended in acquittal. These early court appearances established Caesar's reputation as one of the finest orators of his generation, capable of matching the great Cicero himself in eloquence and persuasive power. His style was said to be more graceful and refined than Cicero's sometimes overwhelming rhetorical displays, marked by a natural elegance that made complex legal arguments seem effortless. Witnesses described his voice as clear and resonant, his gestures graceful and compelling, his entire presence radiating the confidence of a man born to command attention. But oratory alone could not build a political career in Rome. Success required money, connections, and the support of powerful patrons willing to advance a young man's ambitions in exchange for future loyalty. Caesar, whose family's modest means had been further strained by the costs of his eastern adventures, found himself in the common predicament of aristocratic youth. High birth and great expectations combined with limited resources. He solved this problem in the time-honored Roman fashion, through marriage alliances and careful cultivation of relationships with wealthy and influential figures. His marriage to Cornelia had already provided connections to the Popularis faction, while his family ties reached into other political networks. But Caesar's greatest asset was his own personality, a magnetic combination of charm, intelligence, and that indefinable quality the Romans called dignitas that marked him as destined for greatness. The decade of the 70s BCE was a time of relative peace for Rome, but beneath the surface, tensions continued to simmer. Sulla's constitutional reforms had strengthened the Senate and weakened the tribunes of the plebs, but they had not addressed the underlying social and economic problems that had generated political conflict in the first place. The growing gap between rich and poor, the displacement of small farmers by slave-worked estates, and the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a few families continued to create pressure for change. Caesar's early political positions placed him clearly in the populares camp, following the tradition established by his connection to Marius and his own instincts for appealing to the broader citizenry. When he served as military tribune, one of the junior magistracies that provided entry into the Roman political system, he supported legislation to restore some of the powers that Sulla had stripped from the tribunes. It was a position that aligned him with popular sentiment, while marking him as an opponent of the Sullan settlement. His service as quaestor, the first rung on the formal ladder of Roman magistracies, took him to Spain as assistant to the provincial governor. Spain was a challenging assignment, still incompletely pacified despite generations of Roman rule, with fierce tribes in the interior mountains continuing to resist Roman authority. The province offered opportunities for military distinction and personal enrichment, but it also demanded the kind of administrative competence that separated successful governors from failures. Caesar's year in Spain was marked by both military success and personal revelation. Leading Roman forces against rebellious tribes, he displayed the tactical brilliance and personal courage that would later make him one of history's greatest generals. But it was a personal encounter that may have revealed to him the scope of his own ambitions. Standing before a statue of Alexander the Great in a Spanish temple, Caesar is said to have wept, lamenting that at the age when Alexander had conquered the known world, he had achieved nothing of lasting significance. Whether this story is true or merely a later invention designed to highlight Caesar's ambition matters little. It captures something essential about the man and his era. Rome, in the 1st century BCE, was a world where individual achievement could literally reshape civilization, where men like Marius and Sulla could rise from relative obscurity to hold absolute power over millions of people. The examples of such careers burned bright in the imagination of ambitious young Romans, spurring them to ever greater efforts and ever bolder dreams. Caesar's return from Spain marked his entry into the front ranks of Roman politics. He had served competently in a demanding province, returned with enhanced reputation and probably considerable personal wealth, and was now ready to seek higher office. But the path ahead was neither simple nor certain. Roman politics in the late Republic was a complex game where birth, wealth, military achievement, and personal relationships all played crucial roles in determining success or failure. His next major step was seeking election as aedile, one of 4 magistrates responsible for the maintenance of public buildings, the organization of public games, and the general administration of the city. The aedileship was crucial for ambitious politicians because it provided opportunities to win popular favor through lavish entertainment and public works projects. A successful aedile could build the kind of popular recognition that would carry him to higher office. A failed or parsimonious one might see his career stall permanently. Caesar approached the aedileship with characteristic boldness, borrowing enormous sums to finance the most spectacular games and public works Rome had seen in years. His gladiatorial shows featured hundreds of fighters, his theatrical performances attracted the finest actors from across the Mediterranean, and his public banquets fed thousands of citizens. The scale of his expenditure was so vast that his political enemies whispered he was attempting to bankrupt himself into power, but the popular response was overwhelmingly positive. More subtly, Caesar used his position to make gestures that recalled the great populares leaders of the past. He restored monuments to Marius that Sulla had ordered destroyed, and he publicly honored the memory of those who had died in the Marian cause. These actions sent a clear signal about his political alignment, while appealing to citizens who remembered the old general as a defender of their interests against aristocratic privilege. The success of Caesar's aedileship opened the door to his next goal: election as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. This position, held for life, was one of the most prestigious in Rome, traditionally reserved for elder statesmen of impeccable reputation and vast experience. For a man in his 30s to seek such an office was almost unprecedented. But Caesar understood that the pontificate would provide him with a platform and authority that transcended normal political limitations. The campaign for Pontifex Maximus revealed Caesar's political genius in full flower. Facing opponents who were his superiors in age, experience, and traditional qualifications, he turned the election into a referendum on generational change and popular versus aristocratic authority. He campaigned not just among the priests and senators who traditionally determined such appointments, but among the citizens whose support could pressure the establishment to accept his candidacy. His victory in this election was a sensation that reverberated throughout Roman society. The young man who had once been forced into exile by Sulla's power had now achieved one of the highest honors the Republic could bestow, and he had done so through popular appeal rather than traditional channels. It was a demonstration of political skill that marked him as a force to be reckoned with in future contests. As Pontifex Maximus, Caesar gained not only prestige, but also practical advantages. The position came with an official residence in the heart of Rome, enhanced his dignity in public ceremonies, and provided him with religious authority that could be used to influence political proceedings. More subtly, it marked him as a guardian of Roman tradition, even as he challenged traditional power structures, a contradiction that would characterize much of his later career. The decade of the 60s BCE brought new challenges that would reshape Roman politics and provide Caesar with unprecedented opportunities for advancement. In the east, Mithridates of Pontus, Rome's most persistent enemy, had renewed his challenge to Roman authority, requiring a major military response. In Italy itself, a massive slave rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus had shaken the foundations of Roman society, while pirates continued to plague Mediterranean commerce with increasing boldness. These crises created opportunities for ambitious generals to win the kind of military glory that could launch them to supreme power. Gnaeus Pompey, already famous for his victories in Africa and Spain, was granted extraordinary commands that allowed him to clear the Mediterranean of pirates and defeat Mithridates in a series of brilliant campaigns. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, finally crushed the slave rebellion and emerged as a major political force. Both men returned to Rome with vast wealth, military reputations, and personal armies loyal to their commanders rather than the state. Caesar, still building his career through civilian offices, watched these developments with the keen eye of a man who understood that Roman politics was increasingly being determined by military success rather than traditional senatorial authority. The old republic, where power had been shared among equals within a stable constitutional framework, was giving way to a new system where extraordinary individuals could accumulate resources and authority that dwarf traditional institutions. His next step up the political ladder was election as praetor, one of 8 magistrates who served as judges and military commanders. The praetorship was a crucial office that qualified its holder for the consulship, the highest regular magistracy, and for command of important provinces after his year in office. Caesar's campaign for the praetorship was marked by the same lavish spending and popular appeals that had characterized his earlier races. But now he faced more serious opposition from established political figures who recognized his growing threat to their dominance. Caesar's year as praetor was distinguished by his efforts to extend citizenship to residents of northern Italy who had long sought inclusion in the Roman political system. This proposal, which aligned with his popularis politics, generated fierce opposition from conservatives who feared that expanding the citizen body would dilute their own influence. The controversy revealed the growing tensions within Roman society between those who wanted to preserve traditional privileges and those who sought to adapt to the realities of governing a vast, diverse empire. After his praetorship, Caesar received the governorship of Further Spain, a province that offered opportunities for military distinction and personal enrichment. Spain remained a challenging frontier, where Roman authority was constantly tested by fierce tribal resistance, and successful governors could expect to return to Rome with enhanced reputations and considerable wealth. Caesar approached his Spanish command with the same energy and ambition that had marked his earlier career, but now with the added advantage of independent military authority. His campaigns in Spain were marked by tactical brilliance and strategic vision that revealed his emergence as one of Rome's finest generals. Leading his legions against Lusitanian and Celtiberian tribes, he demonstrated the personal courage, tactical flexibility, and inspiring leadership that would later make him legendary. More importantly, he began to develop the relationship with his soldiers that would prove crucial in his later career, earning their loyalty through shared dangers, generous rewards, and genuine concern for their welfare. The wealth Caesar accumulated in Spain finally freed him from the financial constraints that had limited his earlier political activities. Roman governors routinely enriched themselves through various means, some legal and others technically illegal, but universally practiced. Caesar's success in this regard was so notable that he was able to return to Rome with resources sufficient to support the most expensive political campaigns, while also repaying the massive debts he had accumulated during his rise to power. But Caesar's Spanish success created a new dilemma that revealed the tensions inherent in Roman political life. His military achievements entitled him to a triumph, the elaborate victory parade that was the highest honor Rome could bestow on a successful general. However, candidates for the consulship were required to declare their candidacy within the city, and a general awaiting triumph was forbidden to cross the sacred boundary that separated the city from the surrounding territory. Caesar would have to choose between the immediate glory of a triumph and his long-term political ambitions. His decision to forego the triumph in favor of pursuing the consulship revealed the clarity of vision that would guide his entire career. Short-term honors, however glorious, mattered less than the acquisition of real power and the ability to shape Rome's future. It was a calculation that perfectly exemplified the pragmatic ambition that would carry him to unprecedented heights while ultimately contributing to his downfall. The consular campaign of 60 BCE marked Caesar's emergence as one of the 3 most powerful men in Rome. His opponents included Bibulus, a determined conservative backed by the traditional senatorial establishment, and Lucius, a wealthy moderate who represented a middle path between popularis and optimates. The campaign was marked by unprecedented spending on all sides, as each candidate sought to secure the support of the citizen assemblies that would determine the outcome. Caesar's victory in this election was as much a triumph of coalition building as it was of popular appeal. Behind the scenes, he had negotiated a secret agreement with Pompey and Crassus, the two most powerful men in Rome, that would later be known as the First Triumvirate. This alliance combined Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's vast wealth, and Caesar's political skill in a partnership that effectively controlled Roman politics while maintaining the facade of republican government. The agreement was born of mutual necessity. Pompey, despite his military triumphs, had been unable to secure Senate approval for land grants to his veterans or ratification of his eastern settlement. Crassus sought opportunities for the kind of military commands that had brought Pompey such glory. Caesar needed the support of both men to achieve his own ambitions and to secure a profitable provincial command after his consulship. Together, they possessed the resources to override any opposition the traditional establishment might mount. Caesar's consulship in 59 BCE was one of the most consequential years in Roman history, marking the effective end of the traditional republic and the beginning of what would become the imperial system. From the moment he took office, Caesar made it clear that he would not be bound by the constitutional precedents and senatorial traditions that had previously constrained Roman magistrates. When his colleague Bibulus attempted to obstruct his legislation, Caesar simply ignored him, leading to the joke that the year should be dated in the consulship of Julius and Caesar rather than the traditional formula. The legislation Caesar pushed through during his consulship addressed the concerns of all three triumviral partners while appealing to broader popular interests. Land distribution bills provided farms for Pompey's veterans and landless urban citizens. Eastern settlements were ratified, and tax collection contracts were renegotiated in favor of Roman businessmen. Each measure was carefully crafted to build support among different constituencies while weakening potential opposition. But Caesar's most important achievement during his consulship was securing for himself the governorship of Gaul, a province that would provide the platform for achievements that dwarfed anything he had accomplished previously. Gaul was a perfect assignment for an ambitious general, wealthy enough to provide resources for great enterprises, unconquered enough to offer opportunities for military glory, and large enough to require the kind of extraordinary commands that could build personal armies loyal to their commander rather than the state. The Gallic command came with unprecedented scope and duration. Unlike typical provincial assignments that lasted for a single year, Caesar received Gaul for 5 years, with command over 4 legions and the authority to recruit additional forces as needed. It was exactly the kind of extraordinary command that conservative senators had traditionally opposed, but the triumviral alliance had overwhelming strength that made resistance futile. As Caesar prepared to depart for Gaul, Rome buzzed with speculation about what the ambitious consul might achieve in his new province. Some predicted he would enrich himself through peaceful administration of the wealthy Gallic tribes that had already submitted to Roman authority. Others whispered that he harbored greater ambitions, perhaps planning conquests that would rival Pompey's eastern victories. Few imagined that the campaigns he was about to begin would result in the conquest of an entire civilization and the enslavement of 1 million people. The Gaul that awaited Caesar was a land of stunning beauty and fierce peoples, where ancient Celtic civilization flourished in forms that both fascinated and appalled Roman observers. Vast forests stretched across the landscape, broken by rivers that served as highways for trade and war. Fortified hilltop settlements, called oppida by the natives, crowned strategic heights and served as centers of tribal authority. The land was rich in gold and silver, iron and fertile soil, supporting a population that Roman writers estimated at several million people. Celtic society was complex and sophisticated, though organized along lines that seemed strange to Roman eyes. Druids served as priests, judges, and teachers, preserving ancient wisdom through oral tradition and wielding authority that transcended tribal boundaries. Warriors formed an aristocratic class whose prowess in battle brought prestige and followers, while skilled craftsmen created works of art that rivaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world. Yet to Roman observers, the Gauls remained barbarians, whose human sacrifices and warrior culture marked them as natural enemies of civilization. Caesar's first campaigns in Gaul grew out of a crisis that threatened Roman interests without requiring major military intervention. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe from what is now Switzerland, had decided to migrate en masse to new territories in western Gaul, abandoning their mountain homeland for richer lands along the Atlantic coast. Their migration route would take them through the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul, potentially disrupting Roman allies and creating instability along the frontier. When Helvetian ambassadors requested permission to pass through Roman territory, Caesar found himself facing his first major decision as provincial governor. He could grant permission and avoid conflict, or he could refuse and risk being drawn into a war that might prove costly and difficult. For a general seeking military glory, the choice was obvious. But Caesar's decision was based on more than personal ambition. A massive barbarian migration could destabilize the entire region and threaten Roman interests throughout Gaul. Caesar's refusal to grant passage rights led inevitably to conflict as the Helvetii attempted to force their way through Roman territory. The war that followed demonstrated Caesar's military genius for the first time on a grand scale, as he outmaneuvered and ultimately destroyed an enemy force that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Bibracte, where Caesar's legions crushed the migrating tribe, was a masterpiece of tactical leadership that established his reputation as one of Rome's greatest generals. The defeat of the Helvetii was only the beginning of Caesar's Gallic adventure. His victory had been won with the assistance of various Gallic tribes who feared Helvetian expansion, but these alliances created new obligations and opportunities. The Sequani, a powerful tribe that had invited Germanic warriors across the Rhine to assist them against their rivals, now found themselves dominated by their supposed allies. When they appealed to Caesar for assistance, he found himself drawn deeper into the complex web of Gallic politics. The Germanic king Ariovistus presented Caesar with his most formidable opponent yet, a warrior leader whose reputation for ferocity had cowed some of Rome's most experienced centurions. When Caesar's legions showed signs of nervousness before the approaching battle, he addressed them in a speech that demonstrated his mastery of military psychology. Speaking directly to their fears and appealing to their pride as Roman soldiers, he transformed potential panic into determined courage. The battle against Ariovistus was a desperately fought affair that could have ended Caesar's career before it truly began. Germanic warriors, fighting with the fury of men defending their new homeland, nearly broke the Roman line through sheer ferocity. Only Caesar's personal intervention at the crucial moment, riding to the threatened flank and rallying his men through personal example, turned potential defeat into crushing victory. The Germanic survivors fled back across the Rhine, never to return in force during Caesar's governorship. These early victories established patterns that would characterize all of Caesar's subsequent campaigns. His tactical brilliance was matched by strategic vision that saw each battle as part of a larger plan for Roman dominance. His personal courage inspired absolute devotion among his soldiers, who followed him into desperate situations because they trusted his leadership completely. And his political acumen allowed him to exploit divisions among his enemies while building coalitions of native allies who saw Roman protection as preferable to domination by rival tribes. But Caesar's greatest asset was perhaps his ability to learn from both victory and defeat, constantly adapting his methods to meet new challenges. Each campaign taught him something new about Gallic warfare, tribal politics, or the capabilities of his own forces. He was never too proud to abandon a failing strategy or to adopt enemy tactics that proved superior to Roman methods. This intellectual flexibility, combined with iron determination and personal magnetism, made him nearly invincible in the field. The pacification of southern and central Gaul occupied Caesar for 2 campaigning seasons, but each victory only revealed new challenges beyond the horizon. The Belgae, a confederation of tribes in northern Gaul, viewed Roman expansion with growing alarm and began preparing for war. Their reputation as the fiercest warriors in Gaul, combined with their strategic position controlling routes to Britain and Germany, made them natural enemies of Roman expansion. Caesar's Belgian campaigns revealed new dimensions of his military genius. Fighting in dense forests and treacherous marshland, his legions had to adapt their traditional tactics to conditions that favoured guerrilla warfare over set-piece battles. The siege of Sabis, where Belgian forces nearly destroyed 2 Roman legions through a surprise attack, demonstrated both the dangers Caesar faced and his ability to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat through personal leadership and tactical brilliance. The conquest of the Belgian tribes was followed by campaigns that pushed Roman authority to the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. Celtic tribes that had never seen Roman eagles were forced to submit or face destruction, their warriors no match for the disciplined courage of Caesar's veteran legions. Each summer brought new campaigns, new victories, and new territories added to Rome's expanding empire. But it was Caesar's expeditions across natural barriers that truly captured the Roman imagination and established him as a general who could achieve the impossible. His bridge across the Rhine, constructed in just 10 days, was an engineering marvel that demonstrated Roman technical superiority, while serving notice on Germanic tribes that the Great River provided no protection against Roman power. The expedition itself was brief, more a demonstration of capability than a serious attempt at conquest. But its psychological impact was enormous. Even more spectacular was Caesar's invasion of Britain, a mysterious island beyond the ocean that bounded the world. To most Romans, Britain was a place of legend, inhabited by painted warriors who practiced strange rites in sacred groves. Caesar's decision to cross the Channel with 2 legions was an act of such audacious courage that it thrilled his supporters and terrified his enemies. Here was a general who would literally go to the ends of the earth in pursuit of glory and Roman dominance. The first British expedition was more reconnaissance than conquest, but it achieved Caesar's purposes perfectly. Roman soldiers had crossed the ocean and fought successfully against the mysterious Britons, adding to Caesar's reputation for achieving the impossible. The second expedition, conducted with a larger force, penetrated deeper into the island and secured the submission of several tribes, though permanent conquest would wait for a later generation. As these campaigns unfolded year after year, Caesar was transforming not only the map of Europe, but also the nature of Roman politics. His annual dispatches to Rome, written with the same literary skill that marked his oratory, kept his name constantly before the public, while portraying his achievements in the most favorable light. The wealth flowing from his conquests funded political activities in Rome that strengthened his position and weakened his enemies. But Caesar's very success was creating tensions that threatened to destroy the delicate balance of power that had made his achievements possible. In Rome, the triumvirate that had launched him toward greatness was beginning to fracture under the weight of competing ambitions and changing circumstances. Pompey, once content to share power, began to resent Caesar's growing military reputation and popular acclaim. Crassus, seeking military glory to match his wealth and Caesar's victories, embarked on a disastrous campaign against the Parthians that would end in his death and the destruction of his army. The death of Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE fundamentally altered the political landscape of Rome. The triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for nearly a decade was reduced to a rivalry between two men whose ambitions could no longer be reconciled through compromise. Pompey, backed by the conservative Senate that had once opposed him, positioned himself as the defender of republican tradition against Caesar's alleged tyrannical ambitions. Caesar, isolated in Gaul with his legions, found himself increasingly portrayed as an enemy of the state whose conquests masked deeper designs against Roman liberty. The crisis deepened with the death of Caesar's daughter Julia, who had been married to Pompey as part of the original triumviral arrangement. Julia's death severed the personal bond that had helped maintain the political alliance, leaving both men free to pursue their conflicting ambitions without the restraint of family obligation. Pompey's refusal to accept Caesar's offer of a new marriage alliance signaled his intention to break definitively with his former partner. As tensions escalated in Rome, Caesar found himself facing the greatest crisis of his career. The Gallic tribes, sensing Roman disunity and encouraged by news of disasters in the east, began to coordinate resistance on a scale that threatened to undo all of his previous conquests. The revolt that erupted in 52 BCE was led by Vercingetorix, a young Arverni chieftain whose charismatic leadership and strategic brilliance nearly succeeded in driving Rome from Gaul entirely. Vercingetorix represented everything that was most dangerous about Celtic opposition to Roman rule. Unlike previous enemies who had fought as individual tribes or temporary coalitions, he understood the need for unified resistance and possessed the political skill to forge lasting alliances among traditionally hostile peoples. His strategy of avoiding pitched battles while harassing Roman supply lines and communication routes threatened to make Caesar's position in Gaul untenable. The siege of Gergovia marked the lowest point in Caesar's Gallic career, as his legions suffered a rare defeat that cost hundreds of casualties and emboldened rebels throughout the province. For the first time since arriving in Gaul, Caesar found himself on the strategic defensive, forced to concentrate his scattered forces while Vercingetorix's coalition grew stronger with each passing day. The situation was so desperate that some of Caesar's officers began to counsel withdrawal to the safety of the Roman province. But Caesar's response to this crisis revealed the qualities that would make him one of history's greatest commanders. Instead of retreating, he chose to stake everything on a single decisive campaign that would either crush the rebellion or end his career in catastrophic defeat. His march to Alesia, where Vercingetorix had concentrated his forces in what seemed an impregnable fortress, was an act of strategic audacity that risked the destruction of his army for the chance of total victory. The siege of Alesia became one of the most famous military operations in ancient history, a masterpiece of engineering and tactical skill that demonstrated Roman military superiority at its peak. Caesar's decision to surround the hilltop fortress with double lines of fortification, trapping the defenders while protecting his own forces from relief armies, was a stroke of genius that turned the siege into a trap for his enemies rather than a costly assault on prepared positions. The engineering challenges involved in constructing Caesar's lines around Alesia were enormous, requiring the movement of thousands of tons of earth and timber, while under constant harassment from desperate defenders. Roman soldiers, working in shifts around the clock, created a complex system of walls, ditches, and obstacles that effectively isolated Vercingetorix's army, while providing multiple defensive positions for Caesar's forces. The construction itself was a demonstration of Roman military engineering that awed friend and enemy alike. As the siege progressed, Alesia became the focal point for the entire Gallic War. Relief armies gathered from across Gaul, eventually numbering perhaps 250,000 warriors, representing dozens of tribes that had temporarily set aside ancient rivalries to face the Roman threat. For weeks, Caesar found himself caught between the defenders of Alesia and the massive relief force, his 8 legions facing odds that seemed impossible to overcome. The final battle at Alesia was a desperate affair that could have ended in the complete destruction of Caesar's army and the collapse of Roman power in Gaul. Attacked simultaneously from within and without, the Roman lines bent but never broke, held together by the disciplined courage of veteran legionaries and the inspirational leadership of their commander. Caesar's personal intervention at the crucial moment, leading his cavalry in a charge that shattered the Gallic relief army, turned potential disaster into total victory. Vercingetorix's surrender at Alesia marked the effective end of organized resistance to Roman rule in Gaul, though sporadic fighting would continue for another year. The great Celtic chieftain's decision to give himself up to save his followers from Roman vengeance was a noble gesture that even Caesar's enemies acknowledged, though it could not save him from the fate that awaited all defeated enemies of Rome. He would spend 6 years in Roman captivity before being executed during Caesar's triumph. A grim reminder of the price of opposing Roman power. The final pacification of Gaul in the campaigning season of 51 BCE gave Caesar time to consolidate his conquests and prepare for the political crisis that awaited him in Rome. His achievements over 8 years of campaigning were staggering by any measure. An entire civilization conquered, 1 million people enslaved, incalculable wealth added to Roman resources, and the empire's frontier pushed to natural boundaries that would endure for centuries. He had created a professional army whose loyalty was absolute and whose military capabilities were unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. But even as Caesar celebrated his final victories in Gaul, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating rapidly. His enemies in the Senate, led by figures like Cato the Younger and supported by Pompey's growing ambition, were preparing legal attacks designed to destroy him politically and possibly physically. Charges of treason and extortion awaited him if he returned to Rome as a private citizen, while his refusal to disband his armies was being portrayed as proof of tyrannical intentions. The question of Caesar's return to Rome became the central issue in Roman politics during the early months of 50 BCE. His supporters argued that he deserved the right to stand for consul while retaining his command, a privilege that had been granted to other successful generals in the past. His enemies insisted that he must return as a private citizen, subject to prosecution for alleged crimes committed during his consulship and Gallic command. Neither side was willing to compromise, and both began preparing for the civil war that seemed increasingly inevitable. Caesar's own position was clear. He would not return to Rome defenseless against enemies who sought his destruction. Having spent 8 years building Roman power and adding immeasurable wealth to the state treasury, he believed he deserved protection from politically motivated prosecutions. His famous declaration that he would rather die than accept humiliation revealed the pride and determination that had carried him to greatness, but would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The negotiations that occupied most of 50 BCE were conducted against a background of increasing military preparations on both sides. Caesar began moving his legions closer to Italy while publicly protesting his peaceful intentions. Pompey, granted extraordinary authority to defend the Republic, raised new armies while positioning himself as the reluctant champion of constitutional government. Each side sought to portray the other as the aggressor while preparing for the conflict that both sides recognized as inevitable. The final breakdown came in January of 49 BCE, when the Senate passed its ultimate decree authorizing Pompey to take whatever measures were necessary to preserve the state. This Senatus Consultum Ultimum was the Roman equivalent of a declaration of martial law, typically reserved for the most extreme emergencies. For Caesar, it represented final proof that his enemies were determined to destroy him regardless of his service to Rome. Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon River with his army was one of the most momentous in human history, marking the beginning of a civil war that would destroy the Roman Republic and establish the imperial system that would dominate the Western world for centuries. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" entered human language as a metaphor for the point of no return, the moment when all bridges are burned and only victory or destruction remain possible. The river itself was a small stream that marked the boundary between Caesar's Gallic province and Italy proper. Roman law absolutely forbade any general from bringing armed forces across this boundary without explicit senatorial authorization, making Caesar's crossing an act of open rebellion against constituted authority. Yet Caesar portrayed his action not as revolution, but as the defense of his dignity and rights against enemies who sought his illegal destruction. The speech Caesar supposedly delivered to his soldiers before crossing the Rubicon captured the drama of the moment and the rhetoric he used to justify his actions. Speaking of the injustices he had suffered and the honors that were his due, he portrayed the coming conflict as a defensive war against enemies who had violated the constitution they claimed to protect. Whether the words recorded by ancient historians were actually spoken matters less than their symbolic power in expressing the justifications both sides used for the catastrophe that followed. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's crossing revealed the weakness of his enemies' position despite their apparent advantages. Italian towns that should have resisted the invader instead welcomed him as a liberator, their citizens more impressed by his clemency and generosity than frightened by his rebellion. Pompey's hastily raised legions, lacking the experience and loyalty of Caesar's Gallic veterans, showed little enthusiasm for fighting fellow Romans in defense of a Senate that many considered corrupt and self-serving. Caesar's march through Italy was a masterpiece of political and military strategy that demonstrated his understanding that civil war was as much about winning hearts and minds as about battlefield victory. Instead of the terror and devastation that marked most military campaigns, he offered pardons to enemies, protection to civilians, and respect for local customs and property rights. His famous clemency, whether genuine or calculated, created a powerful contrast with the harsh measures his enemies had threatened to employ against him. The speed of Caesar's advance caught his enemies completely off guard. Pompey, who had expected months to prepare his forces and coordinate with allies in the east, found himself forced to abandon Rome and retreat to southern Italy. The symbolic impact of Caesar's unopposed entry into the capital was enormous, suggesting that the gods themselves favored his cause over that of his enemies. But Caesar's occupation of Rome was brief and primarily symbolic. The real war lay ahead, against enemies who controlled vast resources and had the advantage of fighting for what they could portray as constitutional legitimacy. Pompey's retreat to Greece, where he could draw upon the wealth and manpower of the eastern provinces, was a strategic withdrawal rather than a defeat, setting the stage for a prolonged conflict that would span the Mediterranean world. The Gallic wealth that had funded Caesar's rise now proved crucial in maintaining his position during the civil war. While Pompey struggled to extract resources from reluctant eastern cities, Caesar could draw upon the treasure accumulated during 8 years of conquest. More importantly, his veterans' absolute loyalty gave him a military advantage that no amount of money could purchase for his enemies. These were men who had followed him to the ends of the earth and would follow him anywhere he chose to lead. Caesar's decision to pursue Pompey to Greece was both strategically necessary and enormously risky. Crossing the Adriatic in winter with insufficient shipping while facing enemy naval superiority required the kind of audacious courage that had marked his entire career. The campaign that followed would test every aspect of his military genius against an opponent who knew him intimately and possessed resources that matched his own. The siege of Dyrrhachium marked the only serious defeat Caesar suffered during the civil war, as Pompey's superior position and naval support allowed him to inflict significant casualties on Caesar's forces, while avoiding the kind of decisive battle that might have ended the war. For Caesar, the setback was a reminder that even the greatest generals could face situations where courage and skill were insufficient to overcome strategic disadvantages. But Caesar's response to defeat at Dyrrhachium revealed the resilience that separated truly great commanders from merely competent ones. Instead of retreating to lick his wounds, he immediately began planning new operations designed to force Pompey into the kind of battle where veteran loyalty and tactical skill could overcome numerical disadvantages. His march into Thessaly, pursuing an enemy who seemed to hold all the advantages, was an act of strategic boldness that epitomized his entire approach to warfare. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE was the decisive engagement of the civil war, pitting Caesar's outnumbered but veteran army against Pompey's larger but less experienced forces. The tactical details of the battle demonstrated Caesar's mastery of battlefield command, as he recognized and exploited the weaknesses in Pompey's deployment, while motivating his own troops to superhuman efforts through personal example and inspirational leadership. Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus was not merely a military disaster, but a political catastrophe that shattered the coalition that had opposed Caesar. The conservative senators who had supported Pompey as the lesser evil found themselves fugitives, while the eastern kings and cities that had backed his cause hastened to make their peace with the victor. In a single afternoon, Caesar had transformed himself from rebel to master of the Roman world. Yet Caesar's victory at Pharsalus brought new responsibilities and dangers that were in some ways more challenging than anything he had faced during his rise to power. The Roman world expected him to restore order and stability after years of civil conflict, while his supporters demanded rewards for their loyalty and his enemies required either reconciliation or destruction. The constitutional crisis that had triggered the civil war remained unresolved, and Caesar's unprecedented power existed in a legal vacuum that required careful management to avoid provoking new opposition. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey to Egypt revealed both his determination to eliminate all threats to his authority and his fascination with the ancient civilization that had long captivated Roman imagination. Egypt under the Ptolemies represented the last remnant of Alexander's empire, a land where Greek culture had blended with ancient traditions to create something unique in the Mediterranean world. For Caesar, who had always been drawn to the exotic and exceptional, Egypt offered opportunities that transcended mere military necessity. The assassination of Pompey by Egyptian courtiers seeking to curry favor with the victor deprived Caesar of the chance to display the clemency that had become his political trademark. More seriously, it involved him in the complex dynastic struggles that had paralyzed Egypt for generations, as competing claimants to the throne sought Roman support for their ambitions. Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra VII against her brother Ptolemy XIII drew him into a war that served no obvious Roman interest while consuming time and resources he could ill afford. The Alexandrian War that followed demonstrated that even Caesar could make strategic miscalculations when personal interests conflicted with political necessities. His romantic involvement with Cleopatra, whatever its emotional reality, was a political disaster that provided his enemies with ammunition while alienating supporters who expected their leader to place Roman interests above foreign entanglements. The months he spent besieged in Alexandria, while more pressing matters demanded his attention, represented perhaps the greatest error of his career. Yet Caesar's Egyptian adventure also revealed new aspects of his complex personality. His fascination with Alexandria's great library, his discussions with Egyptian scholars, and his apparent genuine affection for Cleopatra showed sides of his character that purely military or political narratives tend to obscure. Here was a man whose intellectual curiosity was as remarkable as his military genius, whose capacity for personal relationships transcended the calculations of power politics. The resolution of the Alexandrian crisis freed Caesar to address the larger challenges that awaited him throughout the Roman world. Enemies who had survived Pharsalus were gathering new forces in Africa and Spain, while political opponents in Rome itself were beginning to question the wisdom of exchanging republican government for one-man rule, however benevolent. The very clemency that had won Caesar support during the Civil War was now seen by some as weakness that encouraged continued resistance. Caesar's African campaign against the remnants of the Pompeian party revealed his continuing military brilliance despite the advancing years and the physical toll of constant campaigning. At Thapsus, his tactical innovations and personal leadership once again proved decisive against enemies who had learned to respect his capabilities, but had not learned how to counter them effectively. The deaths of Cato the Younger and other leading opponents removed some of his most implacable enemies, while creating martyrs whose memory would inspire future resistance. The final campaign in Spain against Pompey's sons represented the last gasp of organized opposition to Caesar's rule, but it also demonstrated the costs of prolonged civil war. Roman fought Roman with a bitterness that earlier conflicts had lacked, as both sides recognized that only total victory could guarantee their survival. The Battle of Munda was Caesar's hardest fought victory, won only through personal intervention when his lines seemed ready to break under desperate enemy attacks. Caesar's return to Rome in 45 BCE marked the beginning of the most creative and dangerous period of his career. Master of the Roman world through military victory, he now faced the challenge of creating a stable government that could manage an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt while satisfying the competing demands of various constituencies. The traditional republican institutions were clearly inadequate for governing such a vast territory, but any reforms risked provoking opposition from those who benefited from the existing system. The constitutional position Caesar created for himself was deliberately ambiguous, avoiding the hated title of king while accumulating powers that made him effectively an absolute monarch. His appointment as dictator for life provided legal cover for his authority, while his consulships, priesthoods, and special honors created an aura of legitimacy that transcended mere military command. Yet this very accumulation of titles and powers alarmed Romans, who had been taught that concentration of authority in a single person was the essence of tyranny. Caesar's reform program during his final years revealed the breadth of vision that set him apart from mere military adventurers or political opportunists. His reorganization of the calendar, which created the Julian system that forms the basis of our modern calendar, was a masterpiece of practical administration that demonstrated his grasp of technical details. His plans for massive public works projects, including new forums and basilicas, showed his understanding that impressive architecture could legitimize political authority while providing employment for the urban masses. More ambitiously, Caesar's citizenship reforms extended Roman legal status to communities throughout Gaul and Spain, beginning a process of imperial integration that would eventually transform the Roman Empire from a system of conquest into a genuine multinational state. His veteran settlement programs not only rewarded loyal soldiers, but also established Roman culture in distant provinces while providing security for frontier regions. These were the policies of a man who thought in terms of centuries rather than years, building foundations for an empire that would endure long after its creator's death. Yet even as Caesar labored to create lasting institutions, the very success of his reforms generated opposition from those who felt threatened by change. Conservative senators who had accepted his victory as irreversible began to resent the marginalization of traditional institutions that his reforms entailed. Veterans who had been rewarded with land grants wondered what would happen to their security if their protector died. Provincial elites who had benefited from his policies feared that a successor might reverse his decisions. Paradoxically, Caesar's success in creating a new order made him increasingly indispensable, while simultaneously making his position more precarious. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar in 44 BCE brought together men whose motives varied widely, but whose common purpose was to restore what they saw as legitimate government through the elimination of tyranny. Marcus Brutus, whose family had expelled the last king of Rome centuries earlier, felt compelled by ancestral obligation to strike down what he saw as a new monarchy. Gaius Cassius Longinus, motivated by personal grievances and philosophical principles, provided the practical leadership that transformed discontent into action. Dozens of other senators, some acting from principle and others from opportunism, joined a conspiracy that eventually included 60 of Rome's most prominent citizens. The assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, was both the climax of the conspiracy against him and the beginning of new conflicts that would consume the Roman world for another decade. The 23 wounds inflicted by his assassins were as much symbolic as physical, representing the collective judgment of the senatorial class against the man who had ended their dominance. Yet the conspirators had planned the murder without considering what would follow, assuming that the death of the tyrant would automatically restore republican government. Caesar's death revealed the extent to which the old republic had depended on his personal authority for stability. Within hours of the assassination, Rome was in chaos as competing factions struggled to fill the power vacuum his death had created. The conspirators found themselves besieged in the capital, while Caesar's supporters rallied around Mark Antony, his colleague in the consulship and longtime lieutenant. The citizens, whose liberty the assassins claimed to have restored, showed little enthusiasm for a restoration that promised new instability and possible civil war. The reading of Caesar's will provided the final twist in a drama that had begun with his crossing of the Rubicon 15 years earlier. His decision to adopt his grandnephew Octavian as his son and heir came as a complete surprise to almost everyone, including the beneficiary himself. The 18-year-old youth, who inherited Caesar's name and fortune, seemed an unlikely candidate to claim the legacy of Rome's greatest general. Yet his adoption would prove to be Caesar's most far-sighted political decision. Mark Antony's funeral oration for Caesar became one of the most famous speeches in Roman history, whether in its historical reality or its later fictional representations. Speaking to a crowd that included veterans, citizens, and slaves who had benefited from Caesar's policies, Antony transformed the funeral into a political rally that turned public opinion decisively against the assassins. The reading of Caesar's will, which left generous bequests to the Roman people and donated his private gardens for public use, completed the transformation of the murdered dictator into a martyred benefactor. The civil wars that followed Caesar's assassination were even more destructive than the conflicts that had brought him to power. The second triumvirate, formed by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, instituted prescriptions that made Sulla's purges seem restrained, while their armies fought campaigns that devastated Italy and the eastern provinces. Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, were hunted down and defeated at Philippi, where they died knowing that their hopes for republican restoration had died with them. But even the defeat of Caesar's assassins could not end the conflicts his death had unleashed. The triumvirs who had united to destroy the conspirators soon turned on each other in a struggle for supremacy that would determine the future of the Roman world. Lepidus, the weakest of the three, was quickly marginalized, while Antony and Octavian built competing power bases that made renewed civil war inevitable. The final conflict between Octavian and Antony was fought as much through propaganda as through military action, as each sought to portray himself as Caesar's true heir while depicting his opponent as a traitor to Roman values. Antony's alliance with Cleopatra provided Octavian with powerful ammunition, allowing him to present the conflict as a war between Rome and foreign enemies rather than another round of civil strife. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra, ended the last challenge to his authority while establishing him as Caesar's undisputed successor. Octavian's transformation into Augustus Caesar marked the fulfillment of his adoptive father's vision while adapting it to changed circumstances. The principate he established was more subtle than Caesar's dictatorship, maintaining republican forms while concentrating real power in the hands of a single ruler. The constitutional settlement Augustus created would endure for centuries, providing the stability that the late Republic had failed to achieve while preserving the imperial expansion that Caesar had begun. The deification of Julius Caesar, formally decreed by the Senate and ratified by popular acclaim, represented the final transformation of the man into the myth that would inspire and terrify future generations. The comet that appeared during games celebrating his life was interpreted as proof of his apotheosis, while the temple erected in his honor provided a focus for the imperial cult that would become central to Roman political and religious life. Caesar the man was dead, but Caesar the symbol would live as long as Rome itself endured. The legacy Caesar left to the world extended far beyond the political institutions he created or the territories he conquered. His literary works, particularly the commentaries on the Gallic Wars, established models of clear, precise Latin prose that influenced writers for centuries. His calendar reform provided the foundation for the chronological system still used throughout the Western world. His legal and administrative innovations created precedents that shaped the development of European law and government. Perhaps most importantly, Caesar's career demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers inherent in individual greatness within a political system designed for collective leadership. His achievements revealed what a single person of extraordinary ability could accomplish when given sufficient resources and authority, while his assassination illustrated the risks that such concentration of power created for both the individual and the state. The tensions between genius and institutions, between personal ambition and collective welfare that marked his life would continue to shape political thought and practice long after his death. The Rome that Caesar left behind was transformed beyond recognition from the city he had entered as a young man seeking his fortune. The narrow factional republic of his youth had become a universal empire that would eventually extend citizenship to all free inhabitants of its territories. The Mediterranean world that had been divided among competing powers was now united under a single authority that would provide peace and prosperity for centuries. The culture that had been purely Roman was now a synthesis that incorporated the best elements of Greek, Celtic, Egyptian, and other traditions. Yet this transformation came at an enormous cost in human life and political freedom that Caesar's admirers too often minimize. His Gallic campaigns alone resulted in perhaps 1 million deaths and the enslavement of countless others, while his civil wars destroyed the Republic and established precedents for autocratic rule that would endure long after the empire's fall. The efficiency and grandeur of the imperial system he helped create should not obscure the violence and oppression on which it was built. The historical reputation of Julius Caesar has fluctuated wildly over the centuries, reflecting changing political circumstances and cultural values as much as scholarly reassessment of ancient evidence. Medieval chroniclers, writing under monarchical systems, generally praised him as a model ruler, whose assassination was a crime against legitimate authority. Renaissance humanists, influenced by republican ideals, tended to view him as a destroyer of liberty, whose death was justified tyrannicide. Modern historians, with access to better sources and more sophisticated analytical methods, have generally adopted more nuanced views that recognize both his achievements and his crimes. What remains constant across all these interpretations is recognition of Caesar's extraordinary impact on the course of human history. Whether viewed as hero or villain, liberator or destroyer, he clearly ranks among the handful of individuals whose actions fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western civilization. The empire he helped create would preserve and transmit classical culture through the Dark Ages, while the precedents he established would influence political development throughout Europe and its colonies. The literary tradition surrounding Caesar has been equally complex and enduring, from ancient historians like Suetonius and Plutarch, through medieval chroniclers, to modern novelists and filmmakers. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, probably the most influential dramatic treatment of his life, established the popular image of the conspirators as noble republicans, while portraying Caesar himself as a flawed but sympathetic figure whose death unleashed chaos. This theatrical tradition has shaped popular understanding of Caesar's significance perhaps more than any scholarly work. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate aspects of Caesar's life and times that were previously known only through literary sources. Excavations in Gaul have revealed the sites of his battles and the extent of Roman influence during his campaigns, while work in Rome itself has uncovered the buildings he constructed and the neighborhoods where he lived. These material remains provide concrete evidence of the transformation he wrought, while raising new questions about the methods and motivations behind his achievements. The geographical reach of Caesar's influence can still be traced across the modern landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean. Cities he founded or refounded, roads he built or extended, and frontiers he established continue to shape settlement patterns and political boundaries long after the fall of Rome. The Latin language he helped spread provided the foundation for the Romance languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people today, while the legal principles he applied became the basis for judicial systems throughout the Western world. Even Caesar's personal characteristics, as recorded by ancient sources and inferred from his actions, continue to fascinate students of leadership and human nature. His combination of intellectual brilliance and practical competence, his ability to inspire absolute loyalty while making deadly enemies, his clemency toward opponents and ruthlessness toward obstacles, all mark him as one of history's most complex personalities. The contradictions in his character mirror the contradictions of the age he helped create, when traditional values competed with imperial ambitions and republican ideals struggled against monarchical realities. The transformation of Caesar from historical figure to cultural symbol began even before his death and accelerated rapidly afterward. His name became synonymous with imperial power, adopted by his successors, and eventually giving rise to titles like Kaiser and Tsar that survived the empire itself. The month of July, renamed in his honor, ensures that his name is spoken countless times each year by people who may know nothing else about him. The phrase "crossing the Rubicon" has entered common usage as a metaphor for irreversible decisions, while "beware the Ides of March" serves as shorthand for warnings ignored. This symbolic Caesar often bears little resemblance to the historical figure, shaped more by political needs and cultural assumptions than by careful study of ancient sources. Dictators throughout history have claimed his legacy while ignoring the values he actually represented, just as republicans have condemned him for destroying institutions they never understood. The real Caesar, insofar as he can be recovered from the sources, was both more complex and more human than either his admirers or detractors typically acknowledge. The final saga of Caesar's story lies not in his death, but in the civilization he helped create. The Roman Empire that emerged from the chaos following his assassination endured for over 1,000 years in the West and twice that long in the East. The legal, administrative, and cultural foundations he helped establish provided the framework for European development throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The precedents he set for imperial expansion and administration were studied and emulated by empire builders from Charlemagne to Napoleon to the architects of modern colonial systems. Yet even as his institutional legacy crumbled with the fall of Rome, Caesar's intellectual influence continued to grow. Renaissance humanists rediscovered his writings and found in them models of clear thinking and effective communication. Enlightenment philosophers studied his career as an example of how individual genius could reshape society, while also warning against the dangers of concentrated power. Modern students of leadership, strategy, and politics continue to find lessons in his successes and failures, his innovations and mistakes. The persistence of Caesar's influence reflects not just the magnitude of his achievements, but also the fundamental questions his career raises about power, ambition, and the relationship between individual greatness and collective welfare. Every generation must grapple anew with the tensions between liberty and security, between tradition and innovation, between local autonomy and imperial unity that his life embodied. The solutions he found to these dilemmas may not be applicable to modern circumstances, but the problems themselves remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. In the twilight years of the Roman Empire, when barbarian kingdoms carved up the territories Caesar had once conquered, his memory became a beacon of lost greatness that inspired dreams of restoration. The Gothic kings who ruled over fragments of his empire adopted Roman titles and tried to govern according to Roman precedent, while Byzantine emperors in Constantinople claimed direct descent from his political legacy. Even as the physical empire crumbled, the idea of Caesar remained powerful enough to legitimize new forms of authority and inspire new attempts at universal dominion. The medieval world that emerged from Rome's ashes carried Caesar's influence in countless subtle ways. The legal codes that governed European kingdoms drew heavily on Roman precedent, while the Latin language he had helped spread provided the foundation for scholarly discourse throughout Christendom. Monasteries preserved his writings alongside sacred texts, ensuring that future generations would have access to his military genius and literary skill. The very concept of empire, with its implications of universal authority and civilizing mission, remained forever associated with his name and example. Charlemagne's coronation as Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day 800 CE represented a conscious attempt to revive Caesar's legacy in a new form. The Frankish king, who had united much of Western Europe under his rule, explicitly modelled himself on Roman precedent, adopting imperial titles and attempting to recreate the administrative efficiency that had made the ancient empire so successful. Though his empire would prove as fragile as its ancient predecessor, the precedent he established would inspire centuries of attempts to restore universal monarchy in Europe. The Holy Roman Empire that claimed descent from Charlemagne's creation perpetuated Caesar's influence through nearly 1,000 years of European history. The title of Caesar, transformed into Kaiser, became the highest dignity the empire could bestow, while imperial coronations in Rome itself served as symbolic links to ancient precedent. The complex relationship between imperial authority and local autonomy that characterized the Holy Roman Empire reflected many of the same tensions that Caesar had faced in governing his vast territories. Medieval chroniclers who wrote about Caesar faced the challenge of reconciling his pagan origins with Christian worldview, often portraying him as an unknowing instrument of divine providence who prepared the world for Christ's message. This interpretation allowed them to praise his achievements while acknowledging the moral problems posed by his methods. The result was a complex literary tradition that presented Caesar as both a model ruler and a cautionary example of the dangers of earthly ambition. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought new attention to Caesar's writings and a fresh appreciation for his literary achievements. Humanist scholars who could read his commentaries in the original Latin marveled at the clarity and precision of his prose, finding in his works models of effective communication that seemed strikingly modern. His ability to describe complex military operations in language that was both technically accurate and dramatically compelling influenced generations of writers who sought to emulate his style. Renaissance princes found in Caesar's career a template for their own ambitions, studying his methods of warfare, administration, and political manipulation as practical guides to effective rule. Niccolò Machiavelli's analysis of Caesar's career in The Prince and other works established him as a central figure in the development of modern political thought, while military theorists like Justus Lipsius examined his campaigns for lessons applicable to contemporary warfare. The printing press ensured that these analyses reached a much wider audience than medieval manuscripts had ever achieved. The religious wars that convulsed Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries saw repeated invocations of Caesar's precedent by rulers who sought to justify their actions through reference to classical example. Both Catholic and Protestant monarchs claimed to be following his model of strong leadership in times of crisis, while political theorists on all sides examined his career for arguments supporting their particular positions. The flexibility of his legacy, capable of supporting almost any political position, testified to the complexity of the historical figure and the continuing relevance of the questions his life had raised. The age of exploration that opened new worlds to European influence was explicitly modelled on Roman precedent, with conquistadors and colonists seeing themselves as extending the civilizing mission Caesar had begun in Gaul. Spanish governors in the Americas adopted Roman titles and administrative methods, while missionary efforts to convert indigenous peoples echoed the cultural transformation that had accompanied Roman conquest. The brutality and exploitation that marked much of this expansion paralleled the darker aspects of Caesar's own achievements, raising questions about the costs of empire that his ancient critics had posed. The absolute monarchies that dominated European politics in the 17th and 18th centuries found in Caesar a powerful symbol of royal authority, unconstrained by traditional limitations. Louis XIV of France, who proclaimed himself the Sun King and built the magnificent palace of Versailles as a symbol of his power, consciously modelled aspects of his reign on imperial Roman precedent. The ceremonies and rituals that surrounded European courts drew heavily on classical models, while royal propaganda emphasized the civilizing benefits of strong central authority. Yet, even as monarchs claimed Caesar's legacy, Enlightenment thinkers began to develop more critical analyses of his career and its implications for human freedom. Edward Gibbon's monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire portrayed Caesar's rise as the beginning of a long process of imperial decay that ultimately destroyed the vigor and creativity of classical civilization. Voltaire and other philosophers examined his career as an example of how individual ambition could corrupt republican institutions, while American revolutionaries like Thomas Jefferson saw in his Dictatorship a warning about the dangers of concentrated power. The American Revolution and the subsequent creation of the United States Constitution reflected both positive and negative lessons drawn from Caesar's career. The founders who designed the new republic were deeply learned in classical history and acutely aware of how the Roman Republic had been destroyed by military strongmen who exploited popular support to override constitutional constraints. The elaborate system of checks and balances they created was designed specifically to prevent any individual from accumulating the kind of power Caesar had wielded, while the strong executive they established was meant to provide the energy and decisiveness that the late Roman Republic had lacked. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power in France provided the modern world with perhaps its closest parallel to Caesar's career, complete with military genius, popular appeal, and the transformation of a republic into an empire. Napoleon himself was acutely aware of the comparison, studying Caesar's campaigns and explicitly modelling aspects of his career on classical precedent. His coronation as emperor, his legal codes, his administrative reforms, and even his eventual exile and death all echoed themes from Caesar's life, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of ancient precedent to modern circumstances. The Napoleonic Wars that reshaped Europe between 1800 and 1815 were fought by rulers and generals who had all studied Caesar's campaigns and sought to apply his lessons to contemporary conditions. The Duke of Wellington, who finally defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, had learned his trade through careful study of classical military texts, while Napoleon's own tactical brilliance drew heavily on Roman precedent, adapted to the realities of gunpowder warfare. The political settlements that followed Napoleon's defeat reflected many of the same tensions between imperial unity and local autonomy that had characterized Caesar's empire. The Industrial Revolution that transformed European society in the 19th century created new forms of power and influence that nevertheless echoed ancient patterns. Railroad barons and industrial magnates who accumulated vast wealth and political influence were often compared to Caesar and other classical strongmen, while the working class movements that emerged in response to industrial capitalism drew on Roman precedent in their struggles for political rights. The expansion of European influence around the globe through steam power and modern weapons was explicitly compared to Roman conquest, with all the moral ambiguities such comparisons entailed. The emergence of modern nationalism in the 19th century created new contexts for Caesar's legacy as various European peoples sought to establish or strengthen their own claims to political independence. Italian patriots like Giuseppe Garibaldi invoked Caesar's memory as they worked to unite the peninsula under a single government, while German nationalists saw in the Holy Roman Empire's complex history a precedent for their own efforts at unification. Even peoples who had been conquered by Rome, like the French and the British, found ways to claim elements of his legacy as part of their national heritage. The democratic revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848 sparked renewed debate about Caesar's legacy and its implications for modern politics. Liberal revolutionaries, who sought to establish constitutional governments, often portrayed him as the enemy of republican freedom, while conservative defenders of traditional authority argued that strong leadership was necessary to maintain order in turbulent times. The failure of many democratic movements to achieve lasting success led some observers to conclude that Caesar's transformation of the Roman Republic had been historically inevitable, while others argued that modern conditions offered better prospects for combining freedom with effective government. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership in 1871 created a new empire that explicitly claimed descent from Caesar's legacy through its connection to the Holy Roman Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm I and his successors adopted imperial titles and ceremonial practices that recalled Roman precedent, while German scholars developed sophisticated historical interpretations that presented Caesar as a predecessor to their own imperial ambitions. The aggressive foreign policy that characterized the German Empire drew partly on classical precedent, with German leaders seeing themselves as extending European civilization through military conquest and political domination. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the beginning of a catastrophic period that would ultimately destroy much of the European political order that had claimed descent from Caesar's empire. The war itself was fought with industrial weapons that made ancient military precedent largely irrelevant, yet political leaders on all sides continued to invoke classical examples to justify their actions and inspire their peoples. The unprecedented scale of destruction and the collapse of several European empires raise fundamental questions about the viability of the imperial model that Caesar had pioneered. The Russian Revolution of 1917 created the world's first communist state, which explicitly rejected the imperial tradition while nevertheless developing new forms of authoritarian rule that echoed ancient patterns. Vladimir Lenin and his successors studied Caesar's career for lessons about the seizure and consolidation of power, while Soviet propaganda portrayed their revolution as the final overthrow of the imperial system that had oppressed working people for millennia. Yet the personality cult that developed around Stalin and the centralized authority structure of the Soviet Union bore striking resemblances to the imperial precedents the Bolsheviks claimed to have destroyed. The rise of fascist movements in Europe during the 1920s and 1930s brought explicit attempts to revive imperial traditions adapted to modern conditions. Benito Mussolini's adoption of Roman symbols and titles was the most obvious example, as he sought to position himself as Caesar's heir, while promising to restore Italian greatness through military conquest and political revolution. Adolf Hitler's Nazi movement drew more selectively on classical precedent, but nevertheless employed many of the same techniques of mass mobilization and charismatic leadership that had characterized Caesar's rise to power. World War II and the Holocaust represented perhaps the ultimate perversion of the imperial tradition, as Nazi Germany attempted to create a new form of empire based on racial ideology and systematic extermination of supposedly inferior peoples. The scale of the crimes committed in pursuit of this vision far exceeded anything attempted in the ancient world. Yet the underlying logic of conquest and domination drew on precedents that stretch back to Caesar's Gallic campaigns. The defeat of fascism in 1945 discredited explicit attempts to revive imperial traditions, but did not eliminate the underlying tensions between power and freedom that Caesar's career had embodied. The Cold War that followed World War II created a new form of global competition between superpowers that claimed to represent opposing political philosophies. Both the United States and the Soviet Union exercised forms of imperial influence that extended far beyond their formal boundaries, while denying that they were empires in the traditional sense. American leaders often invoked classical precedent to justify their global role, while Soviet propaganda portrayed the United States as a modern version of the Roman Empire that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The decolonization movement that dismantled European empires in Africa and Asia during the decades following World War II explicitly rejected the imperial tradition that traced its origins to Caesar's conquests. Leaders of independence movements like Mohandas Gandhi in India and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana portrayed European colonialism as a continuation of ancient patterns of domination that needed to be overcome through non-violent resistance or revolutionary struggle. Yet many of the new nations that emerged from decolonization struggled with the same challenges of governing diverse populations and maintaining political unity that had confronted ancient empires. The technological revolution that transformed global society in the late 20th century created new forms of power and influence that transcended traditional political boundaries. Multinational corporations and international organizations wielded authority that in some ways exceeded that of ancient emperors, while global communications networks created possibilities for both cooperation and conflict that Caesar could never have imagined. Yet the fundamental questions about power, authority, and human nature that his career had raised remained as relevant as ever. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ended the Cold War and created what some observers called a unipolar moment, in which the United States exercised global influence comparable to that of ancient Rome at its height. American military and economic power projected influence around the world, while American culture and values shaped global discourse in ways that echoed the cultural transformation Caesar had imposed on his conquered territories. The debates about American global leadership that emerged during this period often drew explicitly on Roman precedent, with both supporters and critics of American power invoking Caesar's example to support their arguments. The emergence of new global challenges in the 21st century, including terrorism, climate change, and economic inequality, has created new contexts for examining Caesar's legacy and its continuing relevance. The difficulties that democratic governments have faced in addressing long-term problems that require sustained effort and political sacrifice have led some observers to question whether democratic institutions are adequate to meet contemporary challenges. The appeal of authoritarian leaders who promise quick solutions to complex problems echoes many of the same dynamics that brought Caesar to power in the declining Roman Republic. The digital revolution has created new possibilities for both democratic participation and authoritarian control that would have amazed ancient observers. Social media platforms can mobilize popular movements with unprecedented speed and efficiency, yet they can also be manipulated by skilled operators to spread misinformation and undermine democratic discourse. The concentration of technological power in the hands of a few global corporations raises questions about accountability and control that echo ancient concerns about the relationship between wealth and political authority. The study of Caesar's career continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries and historical methods provide fresh insights into his life and times. Recent excavations at sites associated with his campaigns have revealed details about Roman military practices and the impact of conquest on local populations that were previously unknown. Advances in computer modeling and statistical analysis have allowed historians to examine questions about ancient demographics, economics, and military logistics with unprecedented precision. Modern biographers and historians who write about Caesar face many of the same challenges that confronted their ancient predecessors. The source material remains fragmentary and often biased, while the figure himself was so complex and contradictory that any interpretation necessarily emphasizes some aspects of his character while downplaying others. The political climate in which scholars work inevitably influences their interpretations, just as it did for ancient writers who lived under imperial rule or republican governments. The persistence of Caesar's influence in popular culture demonstrates the continuing fascination his story holds for general audiences. Films, television series, novels, and video games continue to find new ways to tell his story, often adapting ancient events to reflect contemporary concerns and values. These popular treatments may not always be historically accurate, but they serve the important function of keeping ancient history alive in public consciousness, while raising questions about power, ambition, and moral responsibility that remain relevant today. Educational institutions around the world continue to teach Caesar's story as part of their curricula, recognizing its importance for understanding both ancient history and contemporary politics. Students who read his commentaries gain insights into military strategy, political leadership, and historical writing that complement their study of modern subjects. The Latin language he helped spread remains a component of classical education, while the historical and political lessons his career provides continue to inform discussions about governance, democracy, and the rule of law. The archaeological sites associated with Caesar's life and campaigns have become important tourist destinations that bring ancient history to life for millions of visitors each year. The Roman Forum where he spoke, the sites in Gaul where he fought his most famous battles, and the place in Egypt where he met Cleopatra all serve as tangible connections to a historical figure whose influence extends far beyond the ancient world. These physical remains provide a sense of immediacy and reality that textual sources alone cannot convey. Museums around the world house artifacts from Caesar's era that help visitors understand the material culture of ancient Rome and the daily life of people who lived under his rule. Coins bearing his image, inscriptions recording his achievements, and military equipment used by his legions all provide concrete evidence of his historical existence, while illustrating the broader social and economic changes his career represented. These objects serve as bridges between past and present, making ancient history accessible to contemporary audiences. The scholarly debates that continue to surround Caesar's legacy reflect the complexity of evaluating historical figures whose actions had profound consequences for subsequent generations. Academic conferences and publications regularly revisit questions about his motivations, methods, and impact, bringing new evidence and theoretical frameworks to bear on ancient problems. The interdisciplinary nature of modern classical studies ensures that historians, archaeologists, political scientists, and other scholars all contribute to our understanding of his significance. The translation of Caesar's works into dozens of modern languages has made his writings accessible to global audiences who might otherwise never encounter ancient literature. Each translation faces the challenge of conveying not only the literal meaning of his Latin prose, but also its literary qualities and historical context. The decisions translators make about how to render particular passages influence how contemporary readers understand both the man and his era. International relations theorists continue to find relevance in Caesar's career for understanding patterns of conflict and cooperation that transcend specific historical periods. His methods of building coalitions, managing alliances, and projecting power across vast distances offer insights that remain applicable to contemporary diplomacy and military strategy. The rise and fall of the empire he helped create provides a case study in imperial overstretch and political transformation that scholars use to analyze modern great powers. Military academies around the world still study Caesar's campaigns as examples of tactical and strategic brilliance that transcend the specific weapons and technologies of his era. His ability to motivate troops, adapt to changing circumstances, and coordinate complex operations across multiple theaters offers lessons that remain relevant to modern military leaders. The ethical questions raised by his methods of warfare continue to inform discussions about the laws of war and the moral responsibilities of military commanders. Political leaders in democratic societies often invoke Caesar's example, though usually as a warning rather than a model to be emulated. The systems of checks and balances that characterize modern constitutional governments were designed partly to prevent the concentration of power that enabled his rise, while the norms and institutions that support democratic governance represent attempts to channel ambition toward constructive rather than destructive ends. Yet the appeal of strong leadership in times of crisis continues to create temptations that echo the circumstances of his era. The environmental consequences of Caesar's campaigns and the broader Roman imperial system he helped create provide sobering lessons about the ecological costs of empire and conquest. Recent research has revealed the extent to which Roman agriculture, mining, and urban development altered landscapes throughout the Mediterranean world, while deforestation and soil erosion caused by Roman activities had lasting effects that are still visible today. These findings add new dimensions to historical assessments of imperial success and failure. Economic historians continue to debate the long-term consequences of Caesar's policies for the development of European and Mediterranean economies. His extension of citizenship, promotion of trade, and monetary reforms had effects that lasted far beyond the fall of Rome, while the wealth extracted from his conquests funded developments that shaped the trajectory of Western civilization. The methods of resource extraction and wealth distribution he employed raise questions about economic justice and sustainability that remain relevant to contemporary debates. The religious and cultural transformations that accompanied Caesar's conquests created foundations for developments that would reshape human civilization. The spread of Greco-Roman culture through his empire provided the context within which Christianity would emerge and flourish, while the administrative and legal frameworks he helped establish created conditions that enabled the preservation and transmission of classical learning through the medieval period. These indirect consequences of his career may ultimately prove more significant than his direct political and military achievements. As our understanding of climate change and its historical effects becomes more sophisticated, scholars have begun to examine how environmental factors may have influenced Caesar's career and the broader transformation of the Roman world. Evidence suggests that the late Republic coincided with a period of climatic instability that may have contributed to the political and social tensions he exploited, while the subsequent imperial period benefited from more favorable environmental conditions that supported population growth and economic expansion. The development of new technologies for analyzing ancient DNA and other biological materials has opened new avenues for understanding the demographic and health impacts of Caesar's campaigns. Studies of ancient remains from sites associated with his conquests are revealing details about nutrition, disease, and population movements that complement traditional historical sources. These scientific approaches to ancient history are providing fresh insights into the human costs and consequences of imperial expansion. The ongoing process of European integration has created new contexts for examining Caesar's legacy and its relevance to contemporary attempts at political unity. The European Union's efforts to create common institutions while respecting national diversity face many of the same challenges that confronted ancient empires, while debates about sovereignty and federal authority echo discussions that date back to his era. The successes and failures of modern European integration provide perspective on the achievements and limitations of ancient imperial systems. Globalization and the emergence of truly worldwide economic and cultural networks have created conditions that in some ways exceed the scope of ancient empires, while raising similar questions about governance, identity, and belonging. The challenges of managing diverse populations with different languages, customs, and political traditions that Caesar faced in Gaul continue to confront leaders who must govern in an increasingly interconnected world. His methods of accommodation and assimilation, along with their costs and limitations, offer insights that remain relevant to contemporary policy debates. The digital preservation of ancient texts and artifacts has made Caesar's legacy more accessible than ever before, while also raising new questions about how historical knowledge is created and transmitted. Online databases and virtual museums allow scholars and students around the world to examine source materials that were previously available only to a few specialists, democratizing access to historical evidence while creating new possibilities for collaborative research and analysis. The study of trauma and its long-term effects has provided new frameworks for understanding the psychological and social consequences of the wars and conquests that marked Caesar's career. Research on how communities recover from violence and displacement offers insights into the resilience and adaptability that enabled some populations to thrive under Roman rule, while others struggled with the consequences of conquest. These perspectives add human dimensions to historical narratives that traditionally focused on political and military events. The emergence of post-colonial studies as an academic discipline has encouraged scholars to examine Caesar's career from the perspectives of the conquered as well as the conquerors. This approach has revealed the agency and resistance of Celtic, Germanic, and other peoples who faced Roman expansion. while also highlighting the cultural creativity and adaptation that characterized responses to imperial rule. These studies complicate traditional narratives of Roman civilization by acknowledging the contributions and sacrifices of all the peoples who were incorporated into Caesar's empire. The development of comparative historical methods has enabled scholars to examine Caesar's career alongside other examples of imperial expansion and political transformation from different times and places. These comparisons reveal both the unique features of his achievements and the broader patterns of human behavior that transcend specific historical contexts. The insights gained from such comparative studies inform our understanding of how societies change and adapt under pressure, while highlighting the recurring challenges that face all human communities. Gender studies and feminist scholarship have brought new attention to the women in Caesar's life and the broader implications of his career for understanding ancient gender relations. The stories of Cornelia, Calpurnia, and Cleopatra provide windows into the experiences of women who lived through the transformation of the Roman world, while analysis of Roman family structures and marriage practices reveals how political change affected private relationships. These perspectives enrich our understanding of ancient society while highlighting aspects of the past that traditional narratives often overlooked. The continuing evolution of democratic institutions around the world provides ongoing contexts for evaluating Caesar's legacy and its implications for contemporary politics. The challenges that face modern democracies, including polarization, inequality, and the erosion of civic norms, echo many of the problems that contributed to the fall of the Roman Republic. The institutional innovations and cultural practices that sustain successful democracies can be understood partly in relation to the failures that enabled Caesar's rise to power. As you settle into peaceful sleep, let these layers of history and meaning wash gently over your consciousness, like waves lapping at the shore of time itself. Caesar's story continues to unfold, not just in the scholarly debates and political discussions that occupy our waking hours, but in the deeper currents of human experience that connect us across the centuries to all who have struggled with questions of power and purpose, ambition and mortality. His legacy lives not only in the institutions he created or the territories he conquered, but in the eternal human quest to build something lasting from the brief span of individual existence. The ancient Romans believed that truly great individuals could achieve a form of immortality through their deeds and the memory of their achievements. In this sense, Caesar succeeded beyond perhaps even his own vast ambitions. His name and story woven so deeply into the fabric of Western civilization that they have become inseparable from our understanding of history itself. Whether viewed as hero or villain, liberator or destroyer, his influence continues to shape how we think about leadership, governance, and the possibilities and dangers of human ambition. Rest now in the knowledge that great stories transcend their historical origins to become part of the larger human story, each generation finding new meanings and relevance in ancient tales. The sleep that approaches carries you into the same eternal rhythm that has claimed all the great figures of history, from Caesar himself to the countless millions who lived and died under the empire he helped create. In dreams, perhaps, the barriers between past and present dissolve, and we can glimpse the timeless truths that connect all human experience across the vast expanse of history. The final chapter of Caesar's story is not yet written, for as long as human beings struggle with questions of power and justice, freedom and security, his career will continue to offer insights and warnings that transcend the specific circumstances of ancient Rome. Each new generation must decide for itself what lessons to draw from his life, what examples to follow, and what mistakes to avoid. In this way, the man who died more than 2,000 years ago remains vibrantly alive, his influence continuing to shape the world long after his physical existence ended in a pool of blood on the Senate floor. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the great currents of history flow like gentle rivers through the landscape of human memory, carrying forward the essential truths and enduring questions that make us who we are. Caesar's name will echo through time as long as human civilization endures, a reminder that individual lives, however brief, can leave marks upon the world that outlast empires and speak across the centuries to touch hearts and minds yet unborn.